To kick things off, it's my privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker is a pioneer whose work has transformed science. He won the 2014 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing super resolution microscopy, a breakthrough that has changed how we see life at the molecular level. Today, he continues to push the boundaries of discovery as a senior fellow at Genelia Research Campus and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. We're honored to have with us today Dr. Eric Betzig.
Let me try to, oh, it's working now.
There we go. All right, so, thanks again for having me. So, which way do I source here, okay. Yeah, I can use that, but also I need some
Yes, we're trying to figure out a little bit of tech issue here.
If there's somebody who can advance it, I can just say things.
Yes, but in the meantime, I'd like to adjust the mic height for you.
Yes. Hello, testing. Is that better? All right.
Professor, could you say next slide? And we
Sure,
will
I'll say
help
next
you.
slide.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I grew up in the 1960s as a child of both Apollo and Star Trek, and I had burned in my DNA from an early age that science and technology are ultimately forces of good in the world. Next slide. So when I entered graduate school and I wanted to do something impactful, I came across an opportunity in a very old technology, which is the optical microscope. So the microscope's been around for 250 years. For the first 150, it was the dominant means by which we were able to study living systems below the level of the naked eye. Next slide. And so microscopes continued to improve up until the end of the 19th century, when a physicist named Ernst Abbe realized that there was actually a fundamental limit to how small a thing you can see in a microscope, which was roughly half the weight of the chart. Next slide. As a result, the optical microscope actually stagnated in the 20th century, and there really wasn't much difference between the microscope you could buy in 1980 versus the microscope you could buy in 1880. Next slide. So what does this limit mean in practical terms? Well, if that's the size of a protein molecule, next slide, then that fuzzy blob is what you would see in an optical microscope. So it's too coarse by a factor of 100 to see how molecules are actually working inside of cells. So all these pictures that you see like that are not because we directly visualized it, but what if we could? What if we could build a microscope that could actually see at that level? Next slide. And so my opportunity was when I went to grad school at Cornell to start to work with two advisors, Mike Isaacson, who was an electron microscopist who figured out how to drill holes in the metal films that were much smaller than the Wick. And he teamed up with a laser spectroscopist, Aaron Lewis, who figured that if he used a high were able to do data storage at about 10 times the density of what existed as the record at the time. But, and in another case, we were able to actually look at the cytoskeleton inside of cells well beyond the diffraction. Because that was my goal. I wanted to make a microscope that could look at living cells with the resolution of an electron microscope. The problem is this cell was not living. It was what's known as fixed or chemically treated to just be held in place. Because the imaging was slow and it took us a long time. Next slide. So there were a couple other breakthroughs we had. So not only was it not possible to see single molecules in that era at their real size, it wasn't even possible to detect that they were present one at a time. So with my near-field microscope, I was able to see single molecules one at a time. And if they were separated far enough from one another, I could even find their position down to just a few nanometers or way beyond the wavelength of light. Next slide. In another experiment, I teamed up with my best friend at Bell Labs, and we started to try to understand the process by which light is generated in semiconductor lasers. We found out that the light doesn't just appear anywhere inside of the laser, but is limited to certain discrete spots. And even with the high resolution of my microscope, these spots were so close together that you couldn't resolve them normally. But it turned out they all glowed in different colors. And so by the combination of looking at them one at a time in different colors, we could study them individually. Next slide. So by this time I've been at Bell Labs for 6 years, and I started to find out what were the real limits of my technology. And the primary one was, yes, you can get really high resolution with a sub-wavelength hole if it's really, really close to the sample. But if it's even, say, half a wavelength away, you lose that resolution altogether. Well, remember, my dream was to study whole cells at super resolution levels. But a cell is a heck of a lot rougher than half a wavelength of light. So my technique was doomed to be from being able to get to that goal. Next slide. So at the same time, because of the successes I was having with the technology, my field became big. All sorts of people were jumping into it. Academics everywhere around the world were starting to do near-field microscopy. Well, most of them had no experience in imaging or microscopy. They published lots of papers, but the papers didn't mean much. There was lots of errors, lots of noise in the system. I say the signal to noise in the field went to zero, because the signal stayed the same and the noise went to infinity. And so I felt like all of that work, much of it academic, was a waste of time and a waste of taxpayers' money, and therefore everything I had done in my career was a net negative society because we were wasting people's money. And so in that frame of mind, I quit Bell Labs right when I was at my most successful. And next slide. And so I learned an important lesson though. Some of you guys may know this guy. He's used to be the vice chair of Berkshire Hathaway. This is the most informative statement I've ever learned in my life. It explains the world. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Academics are largely incentivized to publish papers and get grants. They're not first incentivized to make research discoveries. That's incidental to getting money for their work. Next slide. So I quit in a bitter frame of mind, but a few years before we had had my first baby. And so I became a house husband while my wife worked. And I was pushing my daughter around the stroller one day. And it came to me that I could combine that single molecule experiment that I did with that quantum well experiment I did to find a different way to beat the diffraction. So the idea is, okay, if I look at a normal microscope, each molecule looks like a fuzzy ball, and when they're close enough to the cell, you just get a mush like you see at the upper left. But what if, for example, they glowed in different colors, like in that quantum well experiment? Well, then I can plot them not in 2 dimensions, but in a 3-dimensional space as balls. But now those balls are isolated from one another because of that discrimination in color. And so I could find the center of each of those fuzzy balls, as I had done in my other experiment, to just a few nanometers, and then go back and plot those positions back in the 2D space. So I go from the fuzzy thing at the left to the sharp thing at the right. So that was the concept. And so So instead, I always had a backup plan, is that my dad had a machine tool company in Michigan, which by that time had grown to about 300 people and 70 million in sales. So I went to work for my dad as the VP of R&D. Now, that company was, in the mid-90s, was a great time for Detroit in the auto industry because people were buying cars left and right. But again, at the same time, the writing was still on the wall because the Japanese had already come into the market. And I could see that things were changing. And so the technology used to create parts by the millions per year was based on making custom machines that were very large. They would make these parts without fail. But they were very slow. They were customized to one part, and if the company changed to a new part, you had to build a whole new multi-million-dollar machine in order to make that part. Next slide. And so I invented a technology that would use servo hydraulics to rapidly move large masses very, very quickly and be completely reconfigurable within just a few days to any type of part that we wanted. And so I worked on this technology for 6 years, and I was very, very proud of this technology. 4 years of designing it, 2 years of trying to sell it, and in the end, I sold 2, exactly 2. And so while I learned that I may not be an academic scientist, I'm a really bad businessman. And I learned a couple lessons. Next slide. So this one, if you've ever been in business, you may have heard this. Nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. If I'm a purchasing manager and I can either buy an established technology or some fly-by-night thing from some crazy guy who says he's going to revolutionize everything, it's very, very hard to convince a guy whose whole career is based on his purchasing decision to go with the risky technology. So, next slide. Charlie again. Okay. Show me incentives. There's a very negative incentive for that guy to buy my thing if it goes bad, and only a limited positive incentive. So, all right, well, back into, next slide. Complete darkness now, because now I've failed on 2 careers, and I burned up my backup plan working for my dad. So, what the hell am I going to do? Next. So, I reconnected with my friend Harold that I mentioned earlier, and after Bell imploded in the mid-90s, he ended up working for a company that makes test drive equipment for disk drives in San Diego. When we started to meet, we started to bemoan our fates, and because we both love science, and we wanted to find some way to get back to science. We just met at different national parks and tried to think about what the hell to do in the future. Next slide. And so I was started reading the scientific literature again because I said, yes, I don't like academia, but I love science and I want to do science. And I ran across separated by one another, bigger than the fuzzy ball. Then we can find the centers of each of those fuzzy balls, turn off that subset of molecules, turn on another subset, and go again and again and again until we found the location to a few nanometers of every molecule in the sample. Then we have a super resolution microscope that doesn't require a probe close to the surface. You can do it in any microscope you want. It's trivial. This both excited us and terrified us at the same time because it was so easy. Why hasn't anybody done this already? Next slide. So that's the concept. It's my idea I published 10 years earlier, but now the separation is in time instead of in color. Next slide. So because it terrified us, we said, screw it, we cannot get VC funding to take too long, we cannot write a grant to take too long. Let's just do it with our own money. So Harold quit his job, and then because he's a pack rat, when he left Bell, he took a lot of his equipment with him. So we took all that out of our storage shed, put about 25K each of our own money in, and normally do this kind of entrepreneurial thing like jobs in the garage, but we could do it in his living room because he wasn't married. So within just 3 months, we had the microscope built, but not tested yet. Next slide. And so I contacted the people who developed this photoactivation fluorescent protein, Jennifer Lippincott and George Schwartz, who are at the National Institutes of Health. And I said, we have this crazy idea. Can we bring this microscope to your lab and see if it works? She said, great. And so we did, and that's in her dark room when we set it up. Next slide. And within another month, you see on the left a series of image frames as we're turning on one subset of molecules after another, getting the fuzzy blobs. If you sum the fuzzy blobs, you get the thing in the middle, which is basically just a recapitulation of the normal diffraction limited image. But if instead you find the center of each fuzzy blob and start plotting them on the right, you start to build up a higher resolution image. Next slide. And so after 20,000 images, you go from the diffraction limited image to the left to this super resolution image to the right. Next slide. And if you zoom in, you can see how much better the resolution is. That's with a microscope you can build with your own money inside of a living room. So yeah, it was a big deal. So next slide. So 10 years later, we took new stuff. 2014. Remember, 2004 is when I flamed out of my dad's company, and I was in that black slide. So if ever you're really down about something, remember things change, okay? And if you work to make things change, things will get better. Next. So by another incredibly profitable business, remember Harold and I still didn't have a job at this time. But at the same time, there was this man, Jerry Rubin, who used to be here at Berkeley and was involved in Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And he had the same thoughts as Harold and I did. Why isn't there anything like Bell Labs anymore? Why isn't there anything like the laboratory of molecular biology, where DNA and RNA and the whole field of molecular biology was discovered by about 20 people, which is very much like Bell Labs. Why don't these things exist? I want to make one. So Jerry made one. With Hughes money, he created the Geneva Research Campus in Virginia. And Harold and I were the first two hires. It was perfect for the place. The place was perfect for us. Next slide. Next slide. So this is what Geneva looks like. So Harold and I literally went from rags to riches overnight. It's a very nice facility. Next slide. And so for the next couple of years, I lived and breathed doing this photoactivated localization microscopy. We called it a PALM. Did a bunch of applications. The problem is I was still doing this on fixed and dead cells, because while fluorescent proteins would be live cell capable, as you can imagine, if it takes thousands and thousands of image frames to distill one super resolution image, a live cell is not going to sit still while you're doing that. It's just like leaving the shutter on your camera open for too long. So you could only look at dead things that way. So remember, my dream was to look at living cells with high resolution. Next slide. So there was a way out that led to the rest of my career thereafter. And that was based on a multi-step sequence of transcription and translation. Next slide. So the process that had been built up by years and years of molecular biology and biochemistry studies was the way that this process of making the RNA happens. It's a bunch of proteins gather at one point called a promoter, and then it spits out that blue guy called polymerase, which scoots across the DNA and then spits out a string of RNA. Next slide. So through all of this work by biochemistry, particularly by Bob Tejan, who's here at Geneva, or here at Berkeley, and was at president of HHMI at the time and working with us at Geneva, they figured that this process of putting all of those proteins together that launches the thing would take up to an hour. Well, he wanted to see this live inside cells. So we took an organoid, next slide, where we labeled different proteins that have to come together at that point. And when we looked at these single molecules, not to get a high-resolution image, but just to watch their kinetics of how they move, they didn't stay in one spot for more than a second at a time. So this picture is completely wrong. There's no way the transcription can happen. Next slide. Instead, what happens is there's many copies of each of these proteins, and they buzz like bees around the start where they're supposed to go. And then stochastically, one comes on, then recruits the next, and sort of cascading sequence before that final polymerase does it. Next slide. And so how does that happen? By what magic? You saw in that picture, all these proteins come in one spot out of the goo around. How do they all decide to come to this spot? There's no magnetic field or anything. What's happening? Well, they have these disordered regions which are sticky. And so stochastically, when one gets caught, it stays. And then that's the process by which it goes. Next slide. And so it turns out that there's plenty of diseases that are due to these intrinsically disordered regions of proteins and how they get perturbed in disease, including a child cancer called human sarcoma. And so Tej and I and a couple other guys figured, well, maybe if we can find a way to find drugs that would actually modulate not the ordered regions that other companies study for drug discovery, but these disordered regions, we might find new therapeutics. And so coming to Berkeley, we then did our own study. Next slide, please. Let's go back. One-dimensional product. Can we go back, or is that too far? Anyway, don't worry about it. Okay, so we started this company, and we were fortunate enough to recruit Roger Perlmutter, who was basically the key architect behind Merck's development of Keytruda, their blockbuster cancer drug, and he wanted to do something new and fun. And so he came to run ICON. And so buzz around and they interact with one another. Next slide. They start to form aggregates. Next slide. Those aggregates assemble into bigger assemblages like organelles inside of cells. Next slide. Those organelles come together to create an autonomous and self-replicating system you call a cell. Next slide. Cells start to interact with one another in pairs. And next slide. Into bigger and bigger groups until ultimately you get you and me. So it's levels of emergence, one after another, from the molecular scale up to, in fact, the entire biosphere is the final level of emergence in this process. Next slide. So, what can we learn from that? First is that the only way you'll ever understand any process is if you have all the players, seen and unseen, together. That means you need a whole life cell. Second, animation is what defines life. We can't look at dead stuff, okay? Animation is what defines life, and we have one tool that is good at studying the animate cell, and it is live cell emission, because it's gentle, high resolution, fast, single molecule sensitivity, and it has protein specificity. Next. So, how can you understand life if you don't look at it live? Next slide. So, this is not just an academic exercise, because drug discovery is largely based on all those misguided principles of how life works. And this is particularly true of the AI drug discovery startups. I don't have a lot of confidence in what they'll be able to produce. So Roger said it best, right? He's a guy who has 40 years of drug discovery experience. He says, most drug candidates don't even come close because we have no idea what we're doing. It's a bloody miracle if a drug ever makes it. But what if you can actually watch the processes we can of how cancer cells move through the vasculature and break their way through and start to metastasize other regions? One of a billion other questions you can ask. Next slide. So, the other problem is that cells do not exist in the 2D format that most microscopes are doing this of. They exist in 4D space-time. Well, as luck would have it, I was able to repurpose that optical lattice idea that I had abandoned when we had the idea for Palm, and use it to create ultra-thin sheets of light that sweep repeatedly through cells to give us beautiful 4D movies like that. I contend I have seen life better and in more detail than anybody ever in humanity. Next slide. But the next problem is that cells did not evolve on cover slips. Cultured cells don't look like cells in tissue. In fact, every cell in your body has the same DNA, but a neuron does not look anything like a kidney cell. And that's because the proteins that are eventually expressed are the result of turning on and off genes based on the local environmental cues. So if you're not in the right environment, I'll be damned if a cell on a cover slip is the right environment. You will not get the right phenotypes. It doesn't matter how good your microscope is. You have to take your microscope to the biology, not your biology to the microscope. So we have to look at cells in whole tissues. Next slide. Next slide. So the problem with doing that is this is a transparent fish, and the reason you can see it at all is because the light gets scrambled as it goes through it, the same way water on a windshield. Well, that will completely screw up our microscopes. So the good news is, next slide, is that astronomers fixed this problem 50 years ago when they developed adaptive optics, where they shine a laser into the stratosphere to understand how the atmosphere is screwing up their image of distant galaxies, and they're able to warp a mirror inside of the telescope to exactly compensate for that and get back good image. So next slide. So we steal that idea directly from them, shine a different laser inside of our specimen to correct the aberrations. Next slide. And so you go from this crappy image, and then you turn on the adaptive optics, and you go to that. Okay, now we can finally see our cells and tissues just as well as if they were on a cover slip. Next slide. So this then created our adaptive optical lab selection. By far my favorite paper of what we've done. It reveals all sorts of processes from the development of spinal cord to immune life as it is in a way nobody ever has. Next slide. And furthermore, because you're now looking with high resolution for long periods of time at high speed over vast regions of tissue, we cover 7 orders of magnitude of time, 10 orders of magnitude of volume. But then we ran into our next challenge, next slide, which is that having that much information means you have crazy amounts of data. We take data at 4 terabytes per hour. In a couple-week period, we can get half a petabyte of data. So if you're in AI, it's all about the data. Well, if there's one thing we're really good at is taking lots of data. And eventually, the first step of that was just to pre-process that data. So we had to invent our own tools to be able to do that. But now we can do that in real time at that 4 terabytes per hour. Next. But then we get to the problem which still defeats us, which is that yes, we can have petabytes of beautiful data locked in our server, and guess what? It's meaningless because no human can interpret petabytes of 4 and 5 dimensional data. So, as an example, my colleague now, Gokul Padhayalua, together the two of us run an advanced imaging center here at Berkeley. When he was younger, he took 2 of our papers in multicellular imaging. He spent a year on each and 3 million CPU hours just to scratch the surface of the insights that could come from this data. And so it's incredibly frustrating to have incredibly good tools and no way to do it. Next slide. You can probably guess where this is going. Okay. So, the human mind only was evolved to look at 2D images, or at best 2D images, but plus none. Okay. What we need is minds that can think in 4 and 5 dimensions and report back to us and interpret data at the petabyte scale to unlock the biological discoveries that are inside of our data. Well, we have to build those minds. So we need to build 4 and 5D vision models. Now, I'm the last guy on earth who ever wanted to have anything to do with AI. But go on, next slide. But it has had 3 hits, in my opinion, that have been significant. Of course, large language models, next. AlphaFold, which won the Nobel Prize last year for protein prediction, next one. And of course, autonomous driving. Maybe not quite there, but pretty damn close. What do these 3 things have in common? Well, first, they're based on a newer transformer architecture, next slide, which takes in account the spatial and temporal relationships. Next slide. So, next slide. So, it's also well suited to doing machine vision tasks, as been shown by both Google and Meta in 2D, feature identification with PID, and then segmentation. Next slide. So the problem with the transformer architecture is it requires vast and diverse data for what's known as pre-trained, unannotated. Well, if it's unannotated, that means it's just straight out of the computer. Again, we can do that really well. So next slide. So go ahead and look at those numbers. 600 gigabytes for a large language model, that's a morning's worth of work for us. We need the data all the time. It requires, however, substantial annotated data, which means somebody has to go through and say, this is a horse, or this is a car, or whatever. Next slide. But it is extensible to multimodal models that take in multiple types of data and then apply it to doing multiple tasks. That's really important for what we want to do, because remember, there's 20,000 segment and identify the components inside the cells. Next slide. So in order to get a sense for whether this is even possible at the current state of the art of AI, we got our feet wet by building a three-dimensional model to do that adaptive optics that I told earlier, where we use this guide star like astronomers, but instead just infer it directly from the aberrated images. So we were able to build this model, and it worked successfully, and it gave us the scaling laws to try to understand how much more difficult it would be to get the compute, get the train decide how long it would take to pre-train the model, fine-tune the model, what would be the sizes of the models, what would be the inference time of the models, and the numbers are very sobering. Next slide. So these are the numbers, basically about 100 times the training time of what we've done before. Lots of fish. I could go on and on, but this is aspirational. But it is a good aspiration to have. It's a very large and difficult goal. But we're working, fortunately, with a moving target where the technology we're basing it on is getting better every day. Next slide. So part of that, of course, is getting lots and lots of data. And so we built 2 new types of microscopes to take data at incredible scale. These are both remarkable. Actually, we have 5 such microscopes under construction. And this is another part of the pipeline in addition to making the systems. Next slide. So we call this a cell observatory initiative, and so we require microscopes, specimens, supercomputer level computer storage, and we're world-class ML experts. We're not asking for much. So I make an analogy. Now, I've made many analogies between microscopy and astronomy in my career. Now, what happened in astronomy is up until the end of the 19th century, it was largely done by individuals with telescopes that they created themselves. That was no longer possible in the 20th century. You had the Hooker telescope, the Hale telescope, now you have space telescopes, you have the Keck telescope. None of that can be done by individuals. It has to be done by organizations. So we intend to create an organization because the microscopes are too complex for biologists. The data is almost too complex for anybody. It needs a centralized organization. Next. And so just as astronomy had to go to centralized facilities, we want a cell observatory to explore the space in cells. Next slide. Inputs from biologists will drive it with the questions they want to ask. Then we get the specimens, process the data, do ML, and ultimately have an open source library that biologists can query through an LLM with any question that they want to have. Next slide. So basically this is the workflow under the hood. Tons and tons of questions the biologists ask on the left. That informs what kind of data we collect. It goes into the model to advance the model. Then the model, the LLM has to learn the representations that come from the model so that when we query the model, the LLM will be able to pull the right information from the model and then give that information to the biologist. So the ultimate goal, next slide, from the biologist's point of view, next slide, is this. They don't need to see what's under the hood. They ask the question, what happens when a cancer cell is trying to extravasate through the lens? It will pull up a bunch of images for them to see of that happening. The biologist will say, well, what happens to the shape of the nucleus when it's squeezing through the lens? It'll show you pictures of that. Furthermore, it will show you curves and distributions of this stuff. I have a low opinion of biologists being able to adapt new technology, because I've seen it again. They're very high-bound conservative in what they do. Remember Charlie, right? If they can get a paper with minimum effort, they'll do that. So we have to give them a solution that requires minimum effort and makes them much more productive. So they have adopted LLMs. I don't know, you can't throw a rock at a biologist on that end of campus who doesn't use an LLM routinely. So if they have an LLM interface, they basically just ask their question, get their data right in front of them within seconds, then go dive deeper and deeper, ask more questions. It's like you do with an LLM. more and more data out, then that will be a path to immensely accelerate biological discovery, both at a fundamental level and a translational discovery. And so what do we need? We need AI experts, cluster access, and philanthropists. So we have quite a bit of money, quite a bit of people, but we need a lot more. If you have any rich friends, or you have any friends who are tired of building LLMs and figuring out how to make people more addicted to their screens than they already are, and would rather do something really interesting and impactful instead with their lives, then please point them to me, okay? Because I would love to talk. Next slide. So again, that's it. Next slide. So next. All right, next slide. So, conclusions. All right. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Moneyball a few years ago, but it's about how sports analytics came in the late 90s to sort of transform baseball by making it quantitative. Well, there's a long quote inside of there, which I think is relevant to my situation. There's an epidemic failure within biology to understand what's really happening. And this leads people who run granting agencies to misjudge the opportunities and mismanage their budgets. Biological thinking is illegal. They are asking all the wrong questions. So I think that if we can succeed getting over this last bar, you can see we've been over many bars on the way up, that we will create a revolution in understanding life that will be far more significant than any previous revolution. Thanks. Time for a couple questions. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, we'll have microphone.
Thank you, Eric, for the fantastic presentation. I think you raised a really great direction for how AI is deployed, AI for science. And not for replacing anybody's jobs, but for really advancing our understanding of the natural world. And you also mentioned at the end that advancing that requires a lot of resources. And for something that is philanthropical and scientific as solving for cancer, do you see opportunities for cross-nation collaboration?
That's a good question. Cross-nation is probably hard, is my guess. One of the things that I think about when I try to get funding is there's always strings attached. And so it's like I try to find partners who have the loosest strings. If things start to become multinational, I don't know, but my gut kind of tells me that there's going to be strings. So, one of the reasons I feel like I've been successful in my career is I've never written a grant in my life. So, anytime you work for an organization that has strings, the government has lots of strings, is that I call it the viscosity of science. Okay? All the stuff that you do that is not productive to your goal in terms of writing grants, doing peer review. I could make an infinite list of, and the other thing I would say related to that is that it's really corrosive, not just for the direct time loss, but the opportunity cost of you get into a creative fog. It takes a long time to kind of build these mental models and pictures of your work in your head and what you need to do, or I'm at the microscope and I have to go teach a class or whatever. All of that edifice you build over for 6 hours of work is crashing. You go away for an hour, you come back, and it's all in a pile of graffiti. You have to build it up again, right? And so I really firmly believe, and I take great care, we have good funders, and Hugh still supports me. I have startup funds from Berkeley. CZI provides some of our support too. but I look for founders who trust us and will give us the money and get out of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So you've seen a lot of success in both your academic and private experiences. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about what you see as the intersection between these different sorts of experiences and what has helped you a lot in the midst of all of this.
I guess it depends on how you define academic. Obviously, I benefited greatly from my undergraduate education at Caltech and the opportunities provided for me in graduate school at Cornell. But generally speaking, as I just said, I'm at Berkeley, frankly, under duress. My wife wanted to be here. She loves it here. She was a graduate student here herself. And I knew when I married her that my days would be numbered, and sooner or later, I'd have to leave Geneva and come to Berkeley. So here I am, but I do my best, thanks to Hughes and CCI and the philanthropists, to create as much of a force field around our floor of Barker Hall to keep Cal at bay. Unfortunately, you sometimes cannot avoid Cal administration, which gives me just, makes me climb trees sometimes, but nevertheless, we do pretty well. I would say in general that for young people in the audience, be really broad-minded about your career, okay? Particularly don't feel like, one of the things that, I'm going to go on a long rant here. Number one is most of my postdocs have been Chinese, and they've been great, okay? Because they understand the one thing I understand, which is working. Unlike our first speaker there, I'm not a big believer in work-life balance. There's nothing like hard work. It's actually exponential, okay? So the harder you work, the more you know. The more you know, the more accurate you can be in figuring out what to do next. And it kind of grows like this. There's a very nice essay by a guy who used to be at Bell Labs about this, but it's really true. And Chinese people I've known in general are great hard workers. Chinese people I know have not been really creative. They're really good at doing things, but they're not really the best at really bleeding edge creativity. And I have to say that's true. Most of my postdocs have gone back to China. They're very productive, and their work is good, but it's not, like let's break the mold and do something new, okay? And so my message for young people is, and again, it's Charlie, okay? Charlie is telling them to follow the rules, okay? Charlie is saying, if you follow the rules, maybe someday you will be an academician, all right? Fine if that's your goal. But you have to, I try to find people, have you ever heard Maslow's pyramid hierarchy of needs? Most scientists are down near the slowest level, okay, of basic needs, I want money, I want status, I want this. But you want to find people who are farther up the hierarchy who say, I want to do something impactful. I'm okay if there's a risk with that. I'm okay if I'm going to fail, okay? It's counterintuitive for humans to think that way. But there's always a subset, and those are the people I try to find. And those are the types of people, at least give it some thought as to, don't worry about whether the parents care that you didn't get into USTC or whatever. I mean, so what? You can get a great education anywhere. And with AI and Khan Academy and the internet, the model by which we do education today is completely outdated. And sooner or later it will fall. So learn for yourself. Don't learn for your grade, don't learn for your advice.
As a follow-on, Professor Betzig, I really enjoyed your talk. As a follow-on to that, it sounds like the implication of what you're saying is that students probably should have a broader education. And so that would argue for technical students getting more, social science, humanities, arts, other, so that they can sort of, break out of the narrow domain that they're focused on, because obviously you have to be very focused to do the kind of work you're talking about. On the other hand, you said you went to Caltech. I don't think there's a lot of breadth requirements at Caltech, are
Well,
there?
you'd be surprised.
Okay.
There certainly is a humanities requirement, one class every term. No, every, so yes, 4 times 3 is 12 classes, right? So there's some, I think that creative people cannot be boss. If you have curiosity, even if you're trained as a scientist, all the good scientists I know are fairly well read outside of the basic sciences as well, because they can talk to their curiosity. And certainly there are times when you have to just get away from your problem and think about the rest of the world, right? So I do think it happens a bit organically. I totally agree that I would not want my child to go to a university where it was all science all the time and no breadth at all. I think breadth is very important. Just as a way to give them a compass, even if they don't learn much, but a compass to know that there is a heck of a lot of other stuff out there that can be important to your problem. Yeah, we have a problem.
We have a hand over here in the middle.
Oh yeah, I was gonna ask a question. Great talk, by the way, that was awesome. I've already got my money's worth already. The question is, we invested into a lab, cancer lab, that can make proteins that are specific to curing types of cancer. And the test is pretty amazing. My question is, with your particular technology, which is unbelievable, can you have a living cancer cell and then actively check? Because we're all different, and we respond differently because we're so different.
Right.
Can you actually test it so that you can just keep throwing proteins at a cancer cell until you go, ooh, there's the key that unlocks that and actually kills it?
Yeah.
You can.
Yeah, not in human bodies, but in organoids and things of that sort, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing. Is it being used right now to help cure cancer?
Well, depends on
In
your definition,
individuals?
right? I would say ICON, which is not looking at the whole cancer cell itself, but looking at what happens for cancer, right? It's looking at the proteins that are involved in cancer, like, like immuno-oncology, right, is a big thing, right? Jim Allison. So that first compound from ICON, right, is an immuno-oncology. And the way you find those compounds is by screening the kinetics and how different proteins are involved in key parts of, basically, instead of the evasion strategy, there's another type of evasion strategy that's identified by that single molecule screen that allows us to make Keytruda more effective. And likewise, there's other ones for cancer that involved in this selective lethality, where the cancer cell already has one mutation, which is what causes it to be bad, but therefore it's got a weakness. And if there's another protein that also has to be there in order for the cancer cell to not die, if you can knock out that protein with your drug, then you have a very selective way of killing the cancer. So that's another compound that's come on the scene. So there's other ways of skinning the cancer cat.
Wow. Awesome. We have time for one more question. We'll leave two, the gentleman in black and the woman in the middle in dark as well.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really loved it. My question has to do with when you said that, I guess scientists, or maybe you said specifically biologists, will do the minimum amount of work to just get
I'll say that's a human characteristic.
okay, that kind of already answers my question. But more specifically, my question was, how would we incentivize people to look beyond the material gain of their work? Is there a way for them to like go above like that Maslow?
I've asked myself that question a million times, and I don't really have a good answer. I tried, the best I can do is doing it on a retail level in my own lab, okay? And so what I do is, again, I try to find people who I think are higher on Maslow's hierarchy. And then furthermore, I try to back them as much as possible. But I also work in the lab every day still. Okay? I'm not as fast on my feet as I used to be, but I have a hell of a lot of experience. And I think postdocs benefit, and as we talk about everything. We'll talk about music, we'll talk about whatever. But we're mainly focused on my job, and they start to get my propaganda burnt into their DNA, and I'll burnt into my DNA about what's really important. And so it's hopefully that can propagate as they go out and do their own. I don't have a wholesale way of doing that. So, yeah. And I think the other remark I would say to young people is stay off your phones, stay off the screens. One of the things that I do routinely, right, is I will, at near lunchtime, I would go walk from the park or up Strawberry Canyon and back. And again, the idea is the morning you fill your head with all the problems and doing all this work, and you have to integrate and synthesize it, right? So I just walk up the canyon and back, and I can't, just like when I was pushing my daughter in the stroller and got the idea of the bundle belt, right? It's like, you have to just think of your own, there's so many pieces to the puzzle that you have to integrate, right? And so you can't do that. When I walk around this campus, I consciously count how many people have a phone in their hand or looking at a screen and walking with headphones on their ears. Usually 70, 80%. It's corrosively bad. It's really bad. And thanks to AI, it's going to get even more and more addictive. And so this is my concern for my children. And trust me, my children have been a earful of staying away from screens.
Thank you, Dr. Eric Betzig. We have last question from Marsha Roberts.
Wonderful discussion on point with what drives us as what's the incentive. I like to use passion. What makes you passionate? What are you passionate about to go after? Love the discussion about molecular biology. It took me back a long way. I love the young lady's question in the blue and statement, because I am a full believer of having a growth mindset. And so I would beg to differ that those who are working in your lab didn't have the potential to be creative and curious. And so my question is a kind of a piggyback off of, well, she already asked it about how do we spark that curiosity and get people to thinking at the level, and you're up here, but when you have formidable minds that are willing to learn, it provides opportunities. I'm going to push back on that a little bit. And when you are passionate, you will spend 100 hours a week being chief of staff and a radiologist and supporting these students. So balance in which you...
It comes from passion.
Yes, but
how do you get that passion into people, right?
Yes, spark asking the right questions. So my question is around AI. It is a concern in medicine and radiology that the information goes out will impact and influence, on the outcomes.
Right.
So in your field, how are we making sure that there is diversity of thought? Maybe some of those folks that are maybe labeled as not being curious, how do we get them so that the AI is not so narrow in what we're looking for and what we're trying to discover, that next great drug or.
Yeah. How you get people engaged, I really don't know. This is why I'm here today, right? Is to tell my story. My story is typical. And part of it is to, if not get the passion, try to get rid of the story. Is that you don't have to be taught, you don't have to follow the script, you don't have to do this BS, that, MS, that, PhD, grad, MD, this and that. You can deviate as you wish, following your passion. And you will be amazed at how different experiences you have had in your life, which you didn't think were related to one another at all, somehow come together when you find the right problem and make something.
Thank you again, Dr. Betzig, and thank you for everyone for the thoughtful discussion. Please join me in one more round of applause to Dr. Eric Betzig. In one of Dr. Betzig interviews last year, he said something that really stayed with me. He said he still wanted to be an astronaut. Maybe the line resonated because I've always been fascinated by astronomy, and I love that someone who revolutionized chemistry is still thinking about the space. And when reflecting on what you admire most about Chinese culture, and also in your earlier presentation, you said, is their work ethic. And you said, if I'm not the best, I'm exceptionally unhappy with myself. It's such an honest reflection, the mix of curiosity, discipline, and drive that defines both greatest scientists and the spirit we're celebrating here at Berkeley China Summit. So thank you.